within the Constitution of the United States of America. By some, he's been called controversial. How can I convince you when your ears refuse to hear and turn your heart away from me each time that I draw near? Your eyes refuse to meet with mine, they glance away in fear.
Now, keep in mind that some of my guests have been approached by Homeland Security or FBI saying, why are you going on the Clay Douglas show?
My message to those guys, if they're listening this morning, is go get a cup of coffee. Maybe you'll learn something.
We both took the same vow, to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I don't recall there being an expiration date on that.
He is the free American, Clay Douglas. Catch the Free American weekdays at 7 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Eastern.
Every time I think about the damage that's been done, the anger wells inside me till I'm almost overdone. If I wasn't there, the moon out of the sky and drop the sun.
For the podcast and more details, visit www.freeamerican.com or catch the podcast by phone by calling 832-998-8631.
All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of the Free American. I'm your host. I am Clay Douglas. And I see that Truth Radio is still got their whole schedule screwed up, but I'm going to leave them on, and so you'll hear mixing. Yeah, that's almost the end of it. We just don't need that. But we'll be done with that in a second. Want to tell you I'm in the middle of where Jade Helm is supposed to be. And not much happening here. Because Jade stands for the Joint Assistant in Development for Development and Execution, and it's an integrated mixed initiative prototype whose goal is to provide military planners with the ability to generate a skeleton deployment plan with an extremely fast time period. That is, Jade can generate an 80% logistics solution in less than an hour. Format 2 provides a drag-and-drop interface with the Human Deployment Planner. Parka provides the high-performance knowledge base to pass deployment plans. So all it is a computer program to figure out and anticipate what you're going to do, how you're going to react. The story we've got today is something that would probably scare the hell out of the DARPA planners, the Jade planners, because what we're talking about today is the way normal, decent, honest, caring people react to criminals. John DeNugent is my guest today. Hello, John. How are you?
Good, fine. Good morning to you, Clay, and thanks for having me on your show again.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure, and this is something that's kind of close to my heart because of what we're talking about is a murder and a reaction to that murder and the creation of an entity an entity to cover up the guilty part of the murder. What happened here is 100 years ago, today, actually, they lynched the murderer, and the response was to create an organization called the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, that was really responsible for attacking me when I tried to do something like the folks in Georgia that did with Leo Frank, and we'll get into more details in just a second. But when I saw what the government did to the children at Waco, 17 little children murdered to what? Save them from a child molester? I'm sorry, I'm not buying that. I said I would never sit back and watch something like that happen again without trying to do something about it. I ain't going to watch it on TV. And I did. I started the militias and helped start the militias around the country, advertised and promoted the militia in Montana, the militia in Michigan, and the militia in Albuquerque. Not a terrorist organization like the ADL tried to make it out to be. I did it in the governor's office. In the governor's office, folks. Governor Gary Johnson was the governor. He had my business card. He stopped by and came into my office, into my living room, into my store. We talked about it. So, yeah, the militia was created in New Mexico in the governor's office, finally. And it still exists there today. Hadn't killed nobody, hadn't hurt nobody, and there's been no more incidents like Waco in New Mexico. In the nearby areas. Since then, we've had an effect. Look at the Bundy Ranch. Look what happened there. We have had an effect. This is what happens when people stand up. And that's what happened with Leo Frank. Now, it's just perhaps it could have been an insignificant point that Leo Frank was Jewish. Nobody was mad at Leo Frank because he was Jewish. They were mad at Leo Frank because he was a rapist and a murderer. And this is what you got to remember. This is why I've stopped even referring to criminals who are Jews as Jews, because it gives them too much credit. It gives them too much support. And that support was created by the organization ADL that was put together to try to bribe people to get Leo Frank a new trial after he'd been found guilty of rape and murder and sentenced to hang. Could you, I think you have studied this, and I think you could fill in better than I can, John, on why this happened and what happened 100 years ago today. He was lynched by the responsible and elected officials in Georgia.
Yeah, he sure was. This is a day to celebrate because we tend to feel ridiculously defeatist about Jewish power in America. We can't do anything. They control everything. Well, 100 years ago, Jews controlled most of the newspapers already in this country, and in fact 150 years ago they had tremendous power, and Abraham Lincoln was terrified of the Jews, and the proof of that is when General Ulysses S. Grant, who was then in Tennessee and was conquering Tennessee for the North, issued a famous edict expelling all Jews from the military district of Tennessee because of crookedness and violating his orders and just ripping people off and causing chaos. They came in as merchants. They were, Jews would come in, they'd sell faulty rifles, they'd sell rotten food, they would just go in as rip-off artists, and people were starving, and they'd buy stuff from Jews that didn't work or that was cause food poisoning. I mean, Jews were just causing rage and anger, and they were interfering with the war effort. So Ulysses Grant issued a formal printed order expelling every Jew from Tennessee. And guess who countermanded his order immediately? Because they had telegraphs back then. Abraham Lincoln found out about it right away. Abraham Lincoln, he ordered him to not enforce that order and to revoke it. So way back in 1865, the President of the United States, who was not afraid of the British Empire, he stood up to the British, he stood up to the South, but he didn't stand up to the Jews. So even 150 years ago and 100 years ago, there's tremendous Jewish power. But what happened was, it was so clear that Leo Frank had raped and murdered this beautiful little girl that the Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives, the mayor of Cobb County, which is right next to Atlanta, the capital, the governor at the time of the murder, John Brown, former governors, lawyers, doctors, businessmen, publishers showed up, and they strung this Jew up. And it wasn't because he was a Jew. Just like you say, Clay, it's because the Jews made it into an anti-Semitic incident, when it wasn't. It was just a, quote, normal rape-murder case. And they tried to get him off by saying it's bigotry and anti-Semitism. He says, no, it's not. There's a little girl lying dead. That's what this is about.
Now, let me stop you for just a second. What was Leo Frank? I mean, he was just a owner of a pencil factory. What did he do? What was his claim to fame? Why would they form this whole committee and go through all of these rigmaroles, bribe these people, pressure these people, threaten these people? This is how they work. I've seen them. They've gone after, oh, you're going on the Clay Douglas show? Oh, we're going to ruin you. We're going to go after you. I know how they work. And they've tried to kill me a couple of times. That accident that I had on May 20th, 2004 was arranged. And the 3 months that I spent in a hospital for 3 broken ribs was a little out of the ordinary. I know how they work. Yeah. But what was why were they going so all out for Leo Frank? Who the hell was Leo Frank?
Well, it's a good point. Leo Frank was a young man. He was a young hotshot Jew. He was not the owner of the factory. He was the nephew of the owner. Moses Frank and Sigmund Montag and people like that were the money people. He was a graduate of Cornell. He had an engineering degree from an Ivy League university in upstate New York. But he was like a young star of the powerful Jewish community of Atlanta, which is the #1 city then and now in the South. New Orleans, of course, is an important city. Richmond was, of course, burned down in the Civil War. So was Atlanta. But Northern Yankee money poured into Atlanta. It became an industrial powerhouse, a railroad center, and it's the #1 city in the South today. I mean, you could consider maybe Houston, but Texas is not exactly the South. Texas is a separate culture, as you well know. But in the regular South, or certainly the Deep South, Atlanta is the #1 city. So the Jews poured in. They were carpetbaggers. The South was devastated by General Sherman's deliberate destruction of the Southern economy, Southern farming, slaughtering the animals, setting fire to the farmhouses, burning the city of Atlanta to the ground. So the Jews came in and they bought up Southern property for 10 cents on the dollar. This is what they do. This is why Jews love wars, because they can buy stuff up cheap from starving people, starving and bankrupt people. So they bought up the South after the war. And when the word carpetbagger largely means Jews, Northern Jews. That's who it was. And so these Northern Jews came down and they set up sweatshops. What was a sweatshop? A sweatshop was, you pay the Southern, many of them women and girls, half or 1/3 what a factory worker would get up north. The equivalent of about $2 to $2.50 an hour. You have child labor Mary Phagan, the victim, worked she went to work around age 11 through 13 when she was raped and murdered, 55 hours a week for about $2.50 an hour. That was a sweatshop. There was dirty windows, hot, dingy, depressing. She worked in a pencil factory owned by these Jews, and Leo Frank was the superintendent or the manager. And he would sexually harass these girls and these women, and he'd address them by their first name. Remember, this is the age of Queen Victoria. I mean, there was a proper distance between men and women back then. There was nobody shacked up. There was no fornication. I mean, there was, but it was scandalous back then. People were much more prudish about sex back then. And he would just address these women and girls by their first name. He'd put his hands on their shoulders. He would, with some girls, he would flash cash at them when they came to pick up their pay. And he'd say, "How about it?" And he'd flick his eyebrows up and down, this lecher, this monster. With other women, and he would bring whores in. He'd pay them for sex. He had orgies in the basement. He was a sex fiend. And unfortunately, I hate to even say it on the air, he was deeply into anal sex. He was performing oral sex on whores who hopped up on his desk. He was a sex fiend and a pervert. Let me tell you, oral and anal sex were considered extremely perverse 100 years ago. I mean, it was basically, penis, vagina, normal, the kind that makes babies. And parenthetically, we know a lot more about the human body. The greatest release of endorphins in the brain is normal sex, penis-vagina sex. It releases happiness hormones in the male and female brain, normal sex. Anyways, this guy was very, very kinky. Now you got to remember, why did these girls work in this horrible factory? Because they were hungry and poor. When Leo Frank, he would say to these girls, if they balked, if they made body language like, "Get away from me, take your hands off me," he would say, "I am the superintendent of this factory." He was an open, blatant sexual harasser of these white female Christian girls and women. He would lay it on the line. "I can get you fired if you don't suck my you-know-what, if you don't let me screw you." He was a monster. And today, the guy would go to prison. I mean, he was the Bill Cosby of his day. So that's who he was. But beyond that, to get back to answering your question, he was the president of B'nai B'rith of Atlanta, Georgia. Again, there was a major Jewish community. There have always been Jews in the South because Jews were heavily involved in the slave trade, beginning the slave trade, slave dealers, slave auctioneers. In fact, I did a big blog, an article a year ago on my website, JohnDeNugent.com, about a very powerful book and movie called 12 Years a Slave. It's the heartrending story of a free northern black, born in New England, raised in upstate New York, but he was like born a free black. He never lived down south, was never a slave, but he was an excellent musician with the fiddle, the violin. He was invited by some ruthless white men to go down to Baltimore and Washington, D.C. and perform. They wanted to have him, in restaurants and in, dance halls and whatnot, perform music. That's what they said. They got him down to Washington, D.C., and once you crossed from Pennsylvania into Maryland, you're in a slave state. Washington, D.C. was a slave city. They invited, "Hey, let's have a drink and let's go out to a nice restaurant and celebrate your new career in the music industry." But they put a knockout drug in his food. He felt nauseous and queasy. They said, "Well, let's help you up to your room." So they helped him up to his room up above the restaurant. It was an inn. And he woke up the next morning in a dungeon with chains, in chains. They had knocked him out and they carried him out of his room and put him in a dungeon. And he said, "Well, where am I? What's going on?" They said, "You're now a slave, boy." So this is a heartrending story, and it did go on, because you could get $10,000 in today's money by abducting a free northern black and selling him into slavery down south. Sorry about that road noise outside. Anyways, he wrote a book called 12 Years a Slave. He was finally rescued, by the way, through his white friends. He had experiences with good and bad white people, harsh and kind white slave owners. He had one white slave owner who was very kind, protected his life with his shotgun, stayed up all night to guard his slave from a sadistic white man. And it's all in the book. It's a very good, very honest, factual book. But he describes the slave auctioneer who sold him. And he said he was a white man, but he was much darker than the other white men. And he didn't look like the other white men. And he was very contemptuous toward me. And he didn't dare say it, but he was a Jew. It was a Jew who ran the big slave auctions in Richmond, Virginia. So the Southerners viewed the Southern Jews as their friends because they had supported slavery, they had supported the Confederacy. The second most powerful man in the Confederacy was Judah P. Benjamin, the Treasury Secretary, later Secretary of State. And it was his face on the Confederate dollar bill, Judah P. Benjamin, the Jew. So Southerners did not view their Southern Jews as being their enemies. So they were shocked when this one Jew boy, he was like, I think 29 years old, when he raped and murdered this beautiful Christian girl. She had beautiful, sort of blondish auburn hair, blue eyes, beautiful figure. She was well-rounded for a 13-year-old. She was just she was a knockout is what she was. And he had the hots to conquer her. And when she resisted him, he socked her. She fell back against the iron handle of a lathe machine. It gashed her skull, 2.5-inch gash, right through the scalp into her skull bone. She fell unconscious. This fiend dragged her into the men's toilet and raped and strangled her. It was a horrific, I mean, the last seconds of her life were having this Jew looking up at this Jew, raping her, and with a cord around her neck, strangling her. Those were the last seconds of the life of little Mary Phagan, a 13-year-old girl. Now, if the Jews had been smart, they would have walked away from the case. You know, as I said to you, Clay, before we went on air, in the 1960s, there was a horrific case of an Italian-American named Robert DeSalvo in Boston. He murdered, I think, like 6 white women. Now, the Italian-American community of Massachusetts did not rally to Robert DeSalvo and said, this is anti-Italian discrimination, this is bigotry, this is prejudice. We need to create the anti-defamation against Italians league. No, they just walked away and said, this is a scumbag. You know, we don't defend this guy. Hang him high. Hope he gets the electric chair. That's how Italians viewed it. You know, they washed the hands of the man because he did not represent the best values of the Italian-American community. But the Jews rallied to Leo Frank. Now, the great publisher Thomas Watson said, here's the deal. He was a trial lawyer for 25 years. He'd been a congressman, the vice presidential candidate for the Populist Party in the United States. He went on to become the U.S. Senator. He was a very distinguished Georgian. And he said, the Jews have not objected to other Jews who got the electric chair in New York State. A Jewish gangster kills another Jew or kills a Gentile. They have no problem. The Jews did not rally to that Jew. He says, but Leo Frank was one of the big Jews. He was one of the aristocrats. He was an Ivy League man. He was a star. And he was the president of B'nai B'rith of Georgia. So it was like the Jewish mafia said, we got to defend this guy. He's one of the elite. We have to show if you get in trouble, the big Jews will back you no matter what you did. And besides, all he did was rape this shiksa, this Gentile girl. So what? I hope he had fun. It was evil. It was just like a gang. It's like a pack of wild dogs roaming through a city, and they get into a feeding frenzy, and they attack a human being. It was just a pack mentality. He's one of us, so we're going to defend him. It was a stupid and disastrous decision. If they'd walked away from this, they would have been much better off. They turned a lot of the South into anti-Semites overnight because there was already this concern, Clay, about these sweatshops and these northern Yankees forcing sex on these pure, innocent Southern girls and Southern women. I mean, if there's nothing that'll get people angrier, it's sexual misbehavior because, as I pointed out, humans belong to a rare species of within the mammal kingdom. We're always, so to speak, in heat. Other animals are only in heat and want sex and making babies a couple of times a year, briefly. For example, bears. The female bear's in heat, the male bear's in rut. They do it, and then they separate, and they don't even talk to each other, they don't even see each other again. It's over. Bam. They're out of heat. Humans are always thinking about sex. And so to have this Jew rape this beautiful, pure girl, one of their Southern girls, and she was despite her beauty, she was humble and modest and hardworking. Now, why was she working in the factory? To support her family. Atlanta was growing so fast, it had grown from 80,000 to 150,000 in the space of 1900 to 1910, according to the U.S. Census. So there were not enough school books and not enough school desks in the public schools. So they said, it'll be very hard, Miss Mary, to get you a desk and a book. And she said, that's okay. I'd rather work in the factory and make some money for my family. So she worked 55 hours a week in this hot factory. I'm telling you, it's deep south. I've lived in Atlanta. It can get hot in the summertime. And she worked in there, dingy, filthy windows, and she would put metal tips on the end of these pencils. And that's her work, 55 hours a week. I mean, you think of these spoiled white kids today, don't know the meaning of the word work. At 11, she was working 55 hours a week for this Jew. And he was coming on to her for months. For months, he was all over her. Because she was hot. I mean, she was a hot baby. But he was a sicko pervert. She's 13 years old. She was 4'11". She was a child. And he was a married man. And he had a lot to lose. The president of B'nai B'rith, one of the leading Jews in the city, a future star of the Jewish people because of his Ivy League connections. He should have walked away from this once he saw that she loathed him and despised him, and she was a proper, good Christian girl, was not going to have sex. I mean, it was clear from the look in her eyes. She was never going to submit to him. And she had an older boy named Gant, and she said, will you pick me up when I get off the trolley car to go to the factory? Will you wait there and walk me to the factory? And when I get off work at night, will you walk me from the factory to the trolley car? Because I'm afraid this Leo Frank's going to waylay me, and he's going to try to talk to me or grab me or something. And she was afraid of him. She knew what he was up to, and he knew that she loathed him. So it was a planned rape, and this is what he did. Because the girls were paid so little, and there were no metal tips for the pencils, she'd been laid off all week except that Monday. She only worked one day. She needed to get her pay. She wanted to go to the Confederate Memorial Day Parade, which was on Saturday, April 26, 1913, 102 years ago, in 4 months. So she just wanted to get her pay and maybe get an ice cream cone and watch the parade of the old Confederate veterans and celebrating the South and their bravery in the war between the states. Because the Southerners honored their brave men for their sacrifice and the Southern identity and Southern heritage and Southern pride. Anyways, but it was so little, it was only $1.20. It was like about $20 in today's money because of inflation. It was so little, and she loathed Leo Frank, and she was suspicious of what he was up to. She asked her friend to just go in and pick up her pay for her. Now, Leo Frank constantly did that. In other words, the worker would sign for the other worker and take their pay and then just give them their pay. But Leo Frank did not allow that. He said to this girl, and I think their name was Helen Ferguson. He says, no, she has to come in personally to pick up her pay. So to pick up, in today's money, $20, she went in on a holiday to pick up the pay. She was in and out. That was her intention. Get the money and go. Get away from Leo Frank, this lech who wanted to have his hands all over her. And so she went slightly after noontime, Saturday the 26th, into his office, and she asked him, has the metal come in? In other words, the metal tips for the pencil. There's that little band toward the end of the pencil, which connects the eraser and the wooden shaft of the pencil together. Because that was her job. Because she had not worked all week except for Monday, because they were out of those little metal bands. And he said, let's go back and see. So they walked back. See, this is his setup. Tell her she must come in personally to pick up her pay. And then, since she'd been laid off, then she'll ask, is there any work for me next week? Has the metal come in so I can work and make money, support my family? He said, let's go back and see. So they went back to the metal room where the metal tips would be kept, and he closed the door behind her. And that's when it happened. And as they say, she was a redhead. I think he made some vulgar remark. He grabbed at her. I mean, he'd had the hots for her for months. And here was his chance. He was in a closed room. The door was shut. And the factory, there was, except for the janitor downstairs, the black janitor, Jim Conley, there were some carpenters several floors up hammering away, building a partition 200 feet away, 2 floors up. So there was nobody else in the factory, basically. You could hear a thing. And so he went after her. My theory is, I think she slapped him in the face, because he put his hands on her. He may have made a vulgar remark. He was a vulgar guy. I mean, his come on was, how about it? That's what he would say to his guests. How about it? And he'd flash a $20 bill at them or something. And she was already livid at him for being a snake. And as they say, he clocked her right in the eye. She fell back against a machine, scraped her skull. Blood started pouring out of her scalp. She passed out, hit the ground. He dragged her to the nearby men's toilet, and there he ravished this beautiful maiden. And as she came to and tried to resist, we know she tried to resist because from the testimony of the black janitor, Jim Conley, and the night watchman, Jim Conley rather, her little hands had actually frozen in rigor mortis up in the fending off position. It's a fascinating little detail because Tom Watson, the publisher of the great articles about this case, discussed how in the American Civil War you would sometimes, rarely, see northern and southern soldiers who were killed in battle, and they would actually, their arms were still up, like they were holding a rifle or grabbing for something, and they were shot and killed and literally frozen in position. You wouldn't think so. You'd think rigor mortis would take 5 minutes to set in. In rare cases it would. And Mary Phagan was found by the janitor, Jim Conley, the black janitor, with her little hands up in the air in the fending off position. Like, get away from me, get off me. And Conley, the black man, felt compassion for her and horror at the crime. I mean, everybody knew and liked Mary. He was in terror of Leo Frank, that Leo Frank was going to pin the rape on him, which Leo Frank did try to do. But he took her her hands were already getting very stiff, but he forced her little hands down in a crossover position over her chest, kind of like in reverence for the dead. So that little girl had fought this off to her final seconds. She absolutely, unlike other girls and women, she had not submitted, even at the price of losing her job and losing her income, which was helping to support her family. So Mary Phagan, to me, was almost like a saint. as humans go. And she was, everybody loved her because despite her beauty, she was not arrogant. You know, there'd be church plays and there's school plays, and she was always played Sleeping Beauty. You know, and she would get a kiss from the prince, you know, and whatnot. And boy, Mary had to always be Sleeping Beauty, and she would giggle because she wasn't really into boys. She wasn't really dating. I mean, she'd already had a period. She'd been in puberty, but I have on DeNugent.com, Clay. I have a photo of the dress, and it's just horrific. There's blood all over her neck because the cord cut deeply into her neck, and she was bleeding out of her neck from this huge, heavy twine, and there's blood all over the area of her private parts, blood-soaked. Horrific crime. So that's why 100 years ago today, at about 6 a.m. at dawn, Leo Frank was lynched by the finest men of Georgia.
All right, before we go there, I'm getting an echo here from my voice. Not sure why. But tell me about the black man. They tried to frame the black man, the black janitor there, and it would seem to me that the blacks in Atlanta would be outraged about that. And what was the repercussions from that? I mean, this is part of the story. What can you tell me about that?
Well, I think this is a really explosive issue, and it's one reason why the Jews are now on their 5th Hollywood movie about the evil Southerners and their anti-Semitic bigots. And Leo Frank was a wonderful young man and completely innocent, never harmed a fly, and he's so educated, and he was just in a daze at the amount of bigotry that shocked him and shocked the Jews, and just the mob rule, and boy, the animal came out in these bigoted Southern Gentiles, and you know, constantly, because there was something really explosive, Clay, in this case, because what the Jews after the Civil War had done is they switched gears, and they were saying, oh, the poor blacks, victims of racism, and this is still their tune today, to rile the blacks up against the whites, and the blacks should get civil rights, and the Jews founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In fact, every president of the NAACP from, 1908 until 1965 was a Jew, including Jacob Spingarn and all these other top Jews. Jews funded it, Jews ran it. It was for the blacks, but not run by the blacks at all. So the Jews switched gears, and now they were for the blacks against the prejudiced whites. But to get Leo Frank off, they switched right back. And they over and over said that Jim Conley, whom they pinned the blame on, the black janitor who was innocent, they kept calling him a drunken brute of a Negro. Drunken brute of a Negro, drunken brute of a Negro. The New York Times, everybody, the big Jewish New York papers, all drunken brute of a Negro. Leo Frank was sent to the gallows, condemned to the gallows, only on the word of a drunken Negro. So suddenly, the fact that this powerful testimony was by a black man was of no value because he was black. So the Jews switched gears cynically back to Negro bashing. They went right back into prejudice mode, and you know, you can't send this man to the gallows on the word of a Negro. So they switched right back to get their Jew boy off. The other thing is that Leo Frank himself tried to pin the murder first on the innocent night watchman, who was a Newt Lee, and then on the janitor, whom he had forced to help him to try to dispose of the body. And initially, the janitor, Jim Conley, he was terrified of Jim Frank. As I say, this is the heyday of lynching, Clay, from 1880 to 1920. You know, blacks had civil rights, they had voting rights, They were, after the Civil War, and there was a lot more sexual violence. There were rapes of white women, as there are today. About 100 rapes of white women by blacks every day in the United States, FBI statistics. And it was a problem, and the whites reacted with extreme harshness through lynching blacks who raped white women and girls. And they also, by the way, they lynched white people. 1,300 white people were lynched in the South and in the West and in the North of the United States. 1880 to 1920 was the so-called golden age of lynching. There were about 4,000 lynchings during this period. For Leo Frank to accuse the black night watchman, who was innocent, and then accuse the black janitor of raping and murdering a white girl, that was like an instant death sentence. I mean, you could have white men go right into the jail with their pistols, and they point their pistols at the sheriff and the warden of the prison, and it says, "We're taking so and so," and so, okay, they take him out and they hang you. So he was trying to play on the anger that white men felt towards black rapists, which was very powerful, and send them, innocent men, to the gallows. So now, if African Americans today, Clay, found out how cynically the Jews switched gears and blamed the blacks for the murder of Mary Phagan, specifically the defendant, saying this black guy did it or that black guy did it, and then the legal defense team of Leo Frank and the Jewish newspapers all over America saying, you can't trust the word of a Negro against a white man. Are we crazy? I mean, blacks shouldn't be allowed to testify. This is the first case, Clay, ever where a white man was sent to the gallows, partly, not entirely, there was lots of other evidence, partly on the testimony of a black man, which showed that the whites weren't as, quote, prejudiced as they claimed. This all-white jury of 12 men took very seriously what the black janitor said. And for 8 hours, the Leo Frank defense team, which were legal eagles, the finest lawyers in Georgia, they grilled Jim Conley, the black janitor, on the stand. They tried to pick him apart and intimidate him and ridicule him, and that was his finest hour. Jim Conley, I mean, he was motivated because he didn't want to be hanged himself, because there's only 2 men in that part of the factory at the time of the rape and murder, which was Leo Frank, his boss, and he was just right downstairs by the front door as the day watchman at the front door when he wasn't doing janitor work, sweeping up. So it was either Jim Conley or it was Leo Frank. But because of their proximity, they had to know what the other one was up to, because the rape is just happening not that far away, and the screaming would be not that far away. So what people figured out quickly is that somehow both these men knew what the other had done. So it became incumbent upon Jim Conley to testify that Leo Frank did the murder and then told me, come and help me do something about the body. And the white jury believed this man, and Jim Conley was no angel. The jury had to think long and hard about this. Jim Conley was not a murderer, he was not a rapist. He'd been a pretty good worker, but he had gotten in drunken fights with other blacks. He eventually did 30 days in jail for fighting. He was slow to pay back debts. He'd borrow money from people and not pay him back. Or one white guy asked him to bring me back a pot of beer, and when he came back, I guess Jim Conley had drunk some of the beer and replaced it with water. The guy said, "I'll never trust Jim Conley again." So he was just sort of a,
Let me ask you about Thomas E. Watson. He had a magazine, and he is where you're getting a lot of this information. Who was he, and what happened to him? What were the repercussions from what he did, releasing this right at the same time? 1915?
Right. Well, he was absolutely a key man. Thomas Watson, you know, and talk about the heroes of this case. Thomas Watson, Thomas Edward Watson of Georgia was one of the great heroes because uh, unlike other states where every newspaper was under Jewish control, either through the Jews owning the newspaper or they were the main advertisers in it. I mean, you think of like a newspaper with huge ad for like a department store, you know, and like a huge full-page ad or two full pages. When I lived in Washington, D.C., there was a big department store. They take out two full pages like every day in the Washington Post. That's a lot of money. So either you own the newspaper or you were the main advertiser supporting that paper, keeping it in business. So the Jews controlled everything, but they did not control either the monthly magazine called Watson's Magazine, and they did not control the Jeffersonian, which was his weekly newspaper. He didn't jump onto the case until after the trial was over. The rape and murder and the trial were all in 1913, and Leo was convicted and sentenced to death. In 1914, Tom Watson got involved in the case because he had Jewish advertisers too, and he began to get more and more outraged as he studied the case, because he'd been a trial lawyer for 25 years. He'd been involved in many murder trials. He says, this is ridiculous. The guy is obviously guilty. Why do the Jews let it go? And he got more and more angry because he was a populist. He'd originally been a member of the Populist Party. He was for the little guy. In fact, he was originally very opposed to lynching. He was like against cruelty of any kind. He was against the sweatshops. He was against the economic and sexual exploitation of these white workers, boys and girls, men and women. He was just against humans not having dignity and fairness in their lives. He was, as a congressman, he helped ram through rural mail delivery. So just to show you what kind of a guy he was, in the old days, you could have one or even two mail deliveries a day free in the city. Imagine that, Clay. The mailman would come twice a day to your house with the mail. And if somebody posted a letter to you from the other side of town, you'd have it that afternoon, the same day. But out in the country, there was no mail delivery at all. You'd have to get on your horse and buggy as a farmer, and you'd have to go 25, 30 minutes, buy a horse and buggy or ride into the general store in the nearest village and pick up your mail yourself. And so if you only went once a week, you only got mail once a week. It was Congressman Tom Watson who rammed through rural delivery, which he said was the most expensive expansion of postal service in the history of the U.S. Post Office. He says that country folks have the same right to daily mail delivery as city folks. That was Tom Watson. Tom Watson had a heart of gold for the working class people of America, and especially, of course, of the South as well. He eventually joined the Democrat Party because the Populist Party got weak and flopped. Before that, he had been the presidential candidate of the States' Rights Party in 1908. So he reluctantly joined the Democrats because, you know, just like today, there's only two main parties, Democrats and Republicans. So he eventually joined the Democrats. As a result of his awakening the people of Georgia to the Jewish danger and to the evil of Leo Frank and to the lies and the bribery told against the people of Georgia. And he triggered the lynching by his constant articles in Watson's Magazine in the January, March, August, and then after the lynching, September and October, he justified the lynching and why it was necessary. I mean, this guy was a one-man media between his weekly newspaper and his monthly magazine. And his monthly magazine was for the highly educated, and the weekly newspaper was just average people, high school diploma type people, a little bit lower level, education level.
Now, what's important for our listeners to understand here is that this wasn't what you would think of as a lynching. This man, this Jew, was Leo Frank, was convicted by not one but, three juries? and 5 instances of the court system, county, state, and federal, including twice the United States Supreme Court, had condemned Frank, either indicting him, finding him guilty, or rejecting all of his many appeals. But then you got a crooked governor named John Slayton, commuted Frank's death sentence to life in prison, preparatory to get him another trial, and incredibly, Frank was literally a client of the governor's law firm. That's when the outraged and disgusted white men of Georgia had finally had enough. And these people, the sheriff of Cobb County, judges, a former governor, businessmen, lawyers, stormed the prisons, pistol drawn where Frank was being held, and avenged with the rope the rape and murder of Mary Phagan.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important point. They went by the book on this. This is not a bunch of rednecks squirting tobacco juice between their teeth, hanging a guy, mob rule, or impulsive, or not listening to the evidence. There was no anti-Semitism in the South until this trial. There was none at all. In fact, they liked the Jews. You got to remember, Southern culture was basically Protestant, very few Catholics, except in New Orleans and a few other areas, because of the French and whatnot, and a few Italians moved down there. And some Germans actually were Catholic. But the South was Protestant. The Protestant branch of Christianity heavily emphasizes the Old Testament, which is all about, the history of the Jews, Jewish people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, all these, Jewish stories and folklore, and King David and all that stuff. The Catholic Church is more into the New Testament, but Protestants study the Old Testament a lot. So Protestants have always been somewhat more pro-Jewish than Catholics. It's typical of Americans, Protestant Americans, to have Old Testament names for their kids, like Abraham Lincoln, for example, or Zebulon Pike of Pikes Peak. Zebulon, what kind of name is that? Old Testament name. Furthermore, the Southern Jews had supported the Confederacy and supported the South. There was no anti-Semitism. There was none at all. So Leo Frank was arrested because he was acting very suspicious, and the evidence was accumulating. So the first thing was a coroner's jury by Paul Donahue, the coroner of Fulton County, which is where Atlanta is located. The coroner's jury, they saw the body, they heard testimony, they voted to indict, to recommend that Leo Frank be bound over to a grand jury. And this was signed by the coroner. He says, he ordered the sheriff to hold Leo Frank for a grand jury proceedings. Now, the grand jury was 23 men, of whom 4 were Jews. And they heard the evidence. So the question is, should he be indicted for murder? And they voted unanimously, all 23, including the 4 Jews, including the 4 Jews. They all signed. They didn't even have to. They were so angry and disgusted at this loathsome reptile that they all signed the indictment. And it's right on my website. It's at leofrank.org, and it's at johndenugent.com. It's up there today.
And there I'm reading at johndenugent.com, in regards to what you were just saying, the laws of Georgia are extraordinarily favorable to a person accused of crime. He is not only protected in all of his rights under the Constitution of the United States, but he enjoys privileges far beyond those limits. No indictment against him will stand if it can be shown that a single grand juror was disqualified or failed to take an oath on that particular case. I would imagine that would include the 4 Jews. Therefore, our grand jury, they say, are bound in each case by a special oath in addition to the usual general oath, that they examine the witnesses in each case separately behind closed doors, having the right to call all other witnesses besides those named by the state's attorney, for no other purpose than to allow for the passing away of whatever local prejudice may have been aroused by the first rumors and exaggerations incident to most crimes of violence. If the defense is ready for trial and makes no motion to change the venue, each juror of a legally qualified panel is subjected to a rigid examination as to his freedom from bias and prejudice in that particular case, and the defendant can put each juror separately on trial, the judge being the trier, and offer against the juror such evidence as will prove that he is not, in the eyes of the law, a fair jury to try the case. During the trial, the defendant may act wholly or in part on his own. So what is especially rewarding is also about this issue is how Watson, who was a lawyer himself, adds new reasons for the guilt of Leo Frank to the previous articles in his magazines, previous 2 articles in his magazine, not merely rehashing his old talking points. He was a trial lawyer for 25 years and a legal expert himself.
Okay, yeah, good. Well, it's a very important point. One of the things that that Watson says, 25 years, he was in many murder trials. He was very familiar with murder trials, with murderers, and with the death penalty, and when the death penalty was applied. You know, one of the important points, protections for defendants in the Georgia law, which really bent over backwards to help the person accused by the government give him a fair shake, was that the, sorry, I'm distracted by something here, was that you could decide as the defendant to not speak at all, and the prosecutor was not allowed to point out to the jury he refuses to get up on the stand. Or you could just make a statement, but not under oath, under Georgia law. And the prosecutor could not point out to the jury, hey, he didn't put his hand on the Bible, and he did not just swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He just said a statement, or you could just get up with a written statement and just read it off to the jury. Now, what that means is if you're not under oath, that you can't be cross-examined. In other words, the prosecutor, in this case the brilliant young district attorney Hugh Dorsey, who was up against these old, powerful lawyers on the Leo Frank side, Luther Rosser and Reuben Arnold. These are the top lawyers of their day. And this young prosecutor, oh man, he hit a home run. He hit the ball out of the park. And when he was not allowed to point out to the jury, you know, Leo Frank just got up here and read off a statement. But you notice that he did not swear on the Bible to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and that he refuses to be cross-examined. In other words, he won't allow me as the prosecutor to ask him questions about what he just said, and where he was, and what he did, and why he acted so nervous to the cops, and why he acted strange toward the night watchman, and on and on and on and on and on, and about the 19 girls who testified that he was a lecher, coming on to them, putting his hands all over them, and about the whores and anal sex in the office. He says, this man will not allow me to cross-examine him. Under Georgia law, the prosecutor is not allowed to point that out, that this man refuses to take the oath and refuses to be cross-examined. So the Georgia law bends over backwards to give the man accused by the government a chance to get off and try to prove his innocence. Georgia law is especially favorable to the accused, because, you know, it's a scary thing to have the government come after you. As you know, Clay, and as I know, you got the feds after you, or the state after you, or a mean local cops, or local government trying to make your life miserable, or indict you on some bogus charge. It's a miserable thing to have the state against you. So Georgia law was really protected the accused, especially in a murder case, because you're going to hang. So they gave you every chance. So Leo Frank said his spiel, refused to be cross-examined, and the jury just didn't buy it. The jury said that here's a black janitor who can barely read, and for 8 hours Leo Frank's lawyers grilled him and tried to take him apart and ridicule him and point out this is a black man. I mean, surely you are not going to listen to a black man. This is a white businessman, an educated man. He's an engineer. His friends are powerful. Stop being bigoted. Stop being, I mean, they didn't use the word Nazis because there were no Nazis back then. Stop being prejudiced and anti-Semitic. And it enraged the jury. It enraged the Southern jury. And the Southern men were thinking, you just think you can push a button and point out that Jim Conley's black, and so we'll automatically assume he's guilty because he's black. And we'll automatically assume that because Leo Frank is white, he's innocent. Or because he's a Jew, we should let him go. They were furious at being talked down to. So this is why the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith was created within 2 months of Leo Frank being found guilty and sentenced to death by the court. Because the Jews recognized they'd screwed up big time. They had turned a pro-Jewish South into an anti-Jewish South. And they've been walking around with $100 bills, bribing witnesses, infuriating people. And the Mary Phagan was such a popular, beautiful, pure girl. She was the image of Southern womanhood. Though she was still a girl, I mean, you could just visualize what a wonderful wife she would have made someday, what beautiful children she would have had, what a fine mother she would have been, because she was from a good, hard-working family. There was nothing you could get on that family. No drunkenness, no arrests, no gambling, no nothing. Just hard-working, good Southern working-class people. And, of course, Tom Watson loved these people. He never met Larry Phagan, but he just loved them as the elite of the Southern working-class people. Hard-working, honest, believed in God, went to church, loved the South, loved America, and the women loved their virtue, and they saved themselves until marriage for their husband. So this is a big case. So the Jews are very afraid of this case because it shows Jews attacking blacks, playing the race card, using racism, infuriating Southern whites. It failed. They were like a bull in the china shop, is what they were, Clay. And so they created the ADL so in future attempts to get guilty Jews off, they'd be more smooth, more sophisticated. The bribes would not be out on the street, but they'd be in the back office. They'd be happening in cars. They'd be happening in offices or in country clubs. And then all this stuff would be transacted more in private. It wouldn't be so blatant and in your face anymore. And that's why the ADL was created, because Leo Frank was found guilty. And open bullying of Southerners. I mean, you know, Lee, you're a Texan, and Texas is sort of part of the South. Although you pronounce your R's in Texas. You don't drop the final R. You pronounce your R's in Texas. But, you know, the South is Texas is part of the Confederacy. And, boy, you insult the South, you attack a woman, the warrior will come out of the Southern man. At least in the old days. So the Jews blew it big time. And because of Tom Watson, white men took action. And they went pistols drawn into the Milledgeville State Prison, and they dragged this Jew out in his underwear. They drove all the way back to Atlanta at night, all through the night, 100 miles, taking the back roads. It was scientifically planned. They cut the electric wires to the prison. They slashed the tires, or let the air out of the tires. They cut the phone wires, and they just went to that prison with their pistols and said, "We're taking Leo Frank out. We're taking him with us." And nobody was hurt. Nobody was hurt. Leo Frank was, of course, very unpopular with most Georgians. In fact, another prisoner had slashed his throat and nearly killed him in July, the previous month. And his throat was still healing. Because, I mean, people couldn't stand it. It's just like today. Clay, I mean, if you have raped and murdered a child, man, you don't want to get sent to state prison. Because those other inmates are going to make your life hell. You may be killed. Because he was a pedophile.
Quite
he was
possible.
a child molester.
Yeah. I've been in prison, I've been in jails, and rapists do not fare very well if they're in the same cell block as me.
Yep. I know.
I'm getting an echo again, John. I don't know. You got something else open there?
No, I may say you were railroaded to prison. Was it back in the '60s, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So you've just like Johnny Cash. You've done some time, and you know that the code of honor of prisoners is the lowest of the low. I mean, like to be crude, lower than whale shit. You know, the bottom of the ocean is to harm a child. And I can tell you, I mean, I was molested as a kid. I can tell you this, that I have a lot of insight into this issue here. Many prisoners were molested as kids, and it filled them with rage and anger and disillusionment and cynicism, and it was how they ended up on the life of crime, because they were sexually abused by an adult as a child. I had tremendous anger until I was 49 years old and got to counseling, therapy for what happened to me as a kid. I had nightmares until I was 49. So, you know, prisoners, when a pedophile is sent to state prison, boy, they can't wait to get their hands on this guy. Because many of these prisoners themselves were abused as children. And that's how their life took the wrong track. That's how they went down the wrong fork of the road. Because it's so shattering to a child to have an adult abuse you like that and treat you like nothing. So Leo Frank's throat was slashed in prison already. He almost died. So his neck was healing. And then, of course, the Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives, the former governor, the sheriff of Cobb County, who basically, you know, ran the lynching, because, you know, it's one of the duties of a sheriff is to execute murderers. That's what. I'll give you a little interesting little factoid. Do you know who the one president of the United States was who had hanged a man?
Who's that?
It was the former sheriff of Buffalo, New York, Grover Cleveland.
Okay.
Grover Cleveland was a very it's in an elected position, sheriff, and Grover Cleveland said, this is the dirty work of a sheriff. Somebody has to actually do the hanging, and I'm going to do it, because it's my job. If this man's guilty of murder, then I will hang him myself. And Grover Cleveland hanged murderers in Buffalo. And he later became a very popular two-term president of the United States. And people respected him. He was a Democrat, but he was a conservative Democrat. He was a death penalty Democrat. He didn't believe, oh, the poor murderer, you know, his poor childhood and whatnot, so let's let him go, you know, or let's give him life imprisonment. So the taxpayer can pay for him for 25 years.
Now, John, I like to cover all sides. And since the Southern Poverty Law, since the Jews still believe that Leo Frank was somehow interesting, one of our people in our chat room, Lynn, sent us a article from the SPL Center, spl.org. Fighting hate. They're out there fighting hate. They got this to say about you. John DeNugent, John DeNugent is a prolific writer who has worked with numerous hate groups, including the Neo-Nazi National Alliance and the Holocaust-denying Barnes Review, and individuals like Willis Cardo, and the anti-Semitic founder of both the Barnes Review and the now defunct Liberty Lobby. DeNugent has run for elected office and even vowed one day to become president, while maintaining racist views about numerous racial and ethnic groups. DeNugent is particularly anti-Semitic, believing that the Jews are, along with nefarious space aliens, intent on exterminating the Aryan race.
That's all accurate.
Now, they say, in your own words here,
Yeah.
The Jews control the media, so it spews lies against the enemy they fear most. And the Jews now misrule our beloved country of America, bringing it down by huge bribes, media brainwashing, and blackmail of our officials and police and military officers, both high and low. And worst of all, by a national network of organized pedophiles, child molesting, child murdering adults who, once involved in that network, one orgy at a time, are photographed there, forever captured on film, and that film is stored away for future blackmail use. Those officials cannot quit, even if they want to. You also say that the day will come when the non-white Dems permanently get a lock on the White House. I think they may have done that already. Congress, Supreme Court, and governorships, and state legislatures. Then they will disarm the whites and kill the men, boys, and older women and keep the young, pretty women alive for rape. Non-whites smell weakness. Many are merely intelligent animals. And of course, that's what the Jews say about us, that we're nothing but beasts. And we should exist for their own thing. Everything you have said here, and thank you, SPL, for putting the truth out there, is truth. It's accurate here. It's what we talk about. And it's why we talk about it, because if we don't know that this is coming, if we don't know what the plan is, then we've got a real problem. We've got a real problem here, and I've tried to put this into a way that doesn't fall into the trap they've laid for us, this whole anti-Semitic thing, this whole hate thing. Oh, you're full of hate. Oh, you're a hater. Oh, you know, this is a trap that they've laid for us. It's all spelled out in the Talmud. It's all spelled out in the protocols of the elders of Zion. They know what they're doing. They know what they and they've set a trap for us. Now, how do we? And this is what I've really tried to concentrate on and really tried to consider. How do we avoid that? Because everybody's afraid. I just want to stay below the radar. I don't want to call attention to myself. I don't want to be called anti-Semitic. I don't want to be called a racist. Yeah. So they've laid this trap for us, and the white Christians have fallen right into it. And they don't even understand that the whole term Judeo-Christian, you're falling into the trap that Jesus warned you about. Jesus told you, beware the Jews who call themselves Jews but are not, or of the synagogue of Satan. And he's told you about the Jews being of their father, who was a murderer from the beginning.
Yeah, very much so. You know, I believe in white civil rights and helping the white race survive. And I have friends who are pagans or atheists and whatnot. And I say, look, just look at this logically. The Jews did not murder Buddha, the founder of Buddhism. They did not murder Muhammad, the founder of Islam. And they did not murder Zoroaster, the founder of Zoroastrianism, or so forth. But the Jews did murder Jesus, the founder of the great world religion. Over 1 billion people believe in it, called Christianity. The interaction between the Jews and Jesus is very telling about Jewish behavior, including lies. They lied to the Roman authorities. Jesus is setting himself up to be king of the Jews and and drive the Roman Empire out of Palestine. A lie. And then when Pontius Pilate says, I found no guilt in this man, they said, well, we'll go to Rome and we'll tell Caesar that you, Pontius Pilate, the governor, are no friend of Caesar. So they said, we'll destroy your career and we'll get you in hot water. Our Jewish network in Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire, will get you. So they threatened the governor. So, I mean, in other words, this is a case, the Jews are trying to frame Jesus, and they succeeded. And the Jews were tried and failed to frame the black janitor Jim Conley, and the night watchman knew Lee. So this is an important case, the Leo Frank case, because we can use it to widen the huge gap that already exists between African Americans and Jews. The highest percentage of anti-Semitism in the United States, according to the ADL's own 2009 report, is blacks. 29% of blacks are strongly anti-Semitic. And I know it's true, because I've talked with many blacks, can't stand the Jews. And I have a black friend, and he told me, man, my dad, he was death on the Jews. He couldn't stand them. He couldn't stand them. And then I showed him all the evidence. The Jews started and ran the slave trade and all these other things that I began to show him. And he said, man, so everything my dad said was true. I mean, the blacks are far more aware of the Jewish problem than whites are. And this Leo Frank case is a case of Jews turning on a dime and engaging in vicious black bashing, vicious racism against blacks. See, he's black, therefore he did the murder. It was unbelievable. And Leo Frank is sending his own employees to the gallows. That was his whole intent. Totally innocent men, whom he knew to be innocent because he was the killer himself. I mean, it's really a case which has the potential of opening a gigantic crack between the black and Jewish communities in this country. So this is why, I'm defending it. Yeah, the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is founded by the Jew Morris Seligman Dees, and where all the directors of this poverty center get paid $400,000 a year at the poverty center, and which, by the way, hired almost no blacks until they began complaining. It was like an all-Jew and white operation. It's in Alabama, $400,000 a year for all the members of the board of directors.
They try to use people like you and I to somehow raise money, probably from their own Jewish clientele. Oh, these guys are trying to expose us. They're hate mongers. They're conspiracy theorists. We need to stop them. You need to donate. So they are raising. This is a multi-million-dollar organization. They have that much money to work with to demonize and to slander people like you and I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do. I'd like to say, Clay, if I may, that I got some really great feedback from a blogger named, he's a Polish name, Tom Mistowicz. He was an engineer. He was thrown out of work by the Jews. He lost his career. He's got a wife and kids and whatnot. And he has an excellent blog, and he reacted to my blog today on DeNugent.com. I just completed a huge blog, which was, I added photos to the key August 1915, 100 year ago, article by Tom Watson, The State of Georgia versus Leo Frank. And I added lots of photos, explained it to the modern audience, explained the things which Tom Watson was referring to, famous cases which are not familiar, of course, to us 100 years later today, such as, for example, the fact that the Rothschild Jews got the governor of Kentucky assassinated. And then later on, a crusading publisher, he was shot. In both cases, the killer was not arrested, or the killer was pardoned and got off scot-free, because this governor and this former congressman, who then was a newspaper publisher, had opposed the Rothschild-owned railroads of the Louisville and Nashville railroads. This is William Goebel and a man named Carmack, shot dead in cold blood, and nobody went to prison for it. But these were famous cases 100 years ago. And I explain what all this is about that Tom Watson was writing about. All these other examples of Jews taking over our government, getting people murdered, and the assassin, the murderer, gets off scot-free. I mean, this is really shocking. The only time in the history of the United States that a governor in office was murdered, the governor of Kentucky, William Goebel, because he opposed the Rothschild-owned Don. Remember, the only main mode of transportation back then, before cars, was the railroad. Everything went by railroad, or by canal or ship in those days. But the railroad was everything. There's no trucks, there's no superhighways, No cars, no nothing. So the railroads dominated the state governments and the legislatures, and this governor stood up to the Rothschild-owned Louisville and Nashville Railroad. And they just shot him dead like a dog, 4 days after he assumed office. So Tom Watts is referring to, and I explain all that on JohnDeNugent.com. And what I also just completed was a 4-hour audio book where I actually read the story. So if you can use an MP3, if you go out jogging, or if you're a trucker, or if you're out on the road and you want to hear this, you can hear this whole story as narrated by me. And I've done several audiobooks. In fact, this is partly how I support myself, besides donations. I write on the Leo Frank case, and I also do audiobooks. I do audiobooks for other people. In fact, a patriot from North Carolina said, "I'd like you to read and do an audiobook of Captain Archibald Ramsey's great book called The Nameless War, about World War I and World War II, and how Germany was innocent and Hitler was a good man, and he was a captain and a hero in the British Army in World War I, using the Coldstream Guards. Those are the guards, by the way, which guard Buckingham Palace. But they're an infantry unit. I mean, they fight. And my ancestors were in the Coldstream Guards over in England. They have, the red uniforms, the big black bushy hats, tall hats. That's the Coldstream Guards. So he was a captain of the Coldstream Guards, fought in World War I. And he says, man, this war is a racket. I mean, this is all for the Jews. And Winston Churchill had him arrested. He spent 4 years in prison without charges during World War II because he was so feared, because he represented all the British patriots who said, we don't need a war with Germany. Germans are the good guys. The Germans are standing up to communism. They're standing up to the Jews. We should be allied with Germany. The British Empire should be friends with the German Reich and save Western civilization. So without any charges, 4 years in prison. As a member of Parliament, as a member of the British Parliament, they just grabbed him, threw him in prison. That's the dictatorial power of Mr. Freedom and Democracy, Winston Churchill. So they want me to do an audiobook on that. So I do audiobooks, and I also do a lot. What I also do is I'll take the material and I'll add photos and make a blog out of it, so that people can both hear it and then they can see it and read about it. So I do that. And people say, well, John Nugent, John Nugent's always begging for money, John Nugent. No, actually, I work for a living. I also translate articles and write articles for the Barnes Review magazine. So all you trolls out there, I work just like anybody else. And I've also been a janitor. I've cleaned toilets. I've been a window washer in New York City. I've had my own business. I had a business helping people with foreign accents, or even with New England and Rhode Island accents, to reduce their regional accent. I've done all kinds of regular work. I've worked as a substitute teacher, a high school teacher. I've worked lots of regular jobs. And I still work regular work today. But I try to do it for the cause. So if you have an audio book that you'd like to have narrated by a professional voice, and I studied at the Columbia School of Broadcasting. That's why people like my voice, because I worked hard and I took courses, on improving the human voice, which anybody could do.
I am trying to market or trying to contact some publishers, because frankly I haven't been having too much success on my own shop website, shop.freeamerican.com. I've got 2 books out that are really should, if they had been marketed properly or published in the mainstream, should have gone ballistic, because I write in the same style and the same manner of John D. MacDonald. John D. MacDonald was one of my favorite authors in his Travis McGee series. And so I continued the Travis McGee series under a character that could have been his son, Trevor McGee. And boy, I got all kinds of hassle from John D. MacDonald's son. His son's name is Maynard MacDonald. He lives in New Zealand, and I met him in Miami and mentioned that I was doing a follow-up to the Travis McGee series, and he instantly started trying to destroy that manuscript. No, I'm not going to do that. But if you're not careful and you harass me anymore, I may sue you for child support. And they've got no,
well, you know,
they got no basis to sue me because everything I've written is original. And doesn't matter what name I use, you can't trademark the name McGee.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
So,
well, the Jews try to starve patriots. You could write the best book in the world, but if no bookstore will carry it. And the other problem is if you put it up for free as a PDF online, well, you don't make any income off it. How do you pay your bills?
That's right.
People say, the internet means I want everything free. Well, you know, I mean, this is also affecting the Jewish newspapers. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times have had laid off hundreds of good reporters because everybody just wants to read the New York Times for free online, or the LA Times online, or the Washington Post online. Hundreds of reporters have been laid off. Or maybe you could be a man with a wife and 2 kids and be a reporter for the Washington Post, and they're paying you $27,000 a year. I mean, you think, oh, I'm a reporter for the Washington Post, I'm making big bucks. Not anymore. The internet's a two-edged sword. Everybody wants it for free. I have a friend who does incredible music, but they keep him out of the music industry because he writes protest songs about the Jews taking over America and 9/11 and whatnot. And John Niems, Niems, and I've got to really promote him. And his music, man, you can't get the music out of your ears. It'll stay with you for weeks. He's a genius. He's incredibly good, John, Niems. He's got songs about the Holocaust, 9/11, and the murder of John Kennedy, and the CIA bumping people off. But the music itself, no matter what the lyrics, the content of the music is incredible. And the Jews are trying to shut him down. So it's a serious problem. That's why donations are important, because the Jews... I was sent a book, an incredible book in French. It's called Semitic Anti-Christianism. Not Christian anti-Semitism, but Semitic anti-Christianism. And it shows a giant Star of David, and the bottom point of the 6-pointed star is stabbing into a cross lying on the ground. And it's about Jews persecuting Christians. And I learned a ton of stuff from this book, but the entire publishing house is basically out of business. And no bookstore will carry the book in France. It should be translated into English. I mean, did you know, Clay, and our listeners right now, did you know that Christianity was a completely tolerated religion originally in the Roman Empire? It was viewed as an offshoot of Judaism, which was an officially tolerated religion. Jesus was just considered, you know, a Jew who had disagreed with the other Jews and, you know, and was executed, but it was not viewed as a dangerous religion. But the Jews worked on the wife of the Emperor Nero, and when Rome burned down in a huge fire, people were angry at the emperor for allowing it to happen. So his wife said, blame it on the Christians. So Christianity was banned, and that began 250 years of vicious, horrific persecution by Jews egging on the people and riling up the Roman government against the Christians. Did you know Christians drink the blood of little children? Did you know that Christians are cannibals? Because you remember Jesus said, you know, at the Last Supper, you know, eat this bread is means my body, and this wine, you know, means my blood, you know, I'm dying for your sins and so forth. Okay, the Christians are cannibals. They drink blood and they eat human flesh. And they do disgusting things to children, and they eat children. And they said, and they're trying to overthrow the Roman Empire, and they're insulting our religion. The Jews, for 250 years, succeeded in riling up Roman emperors and Roman governors and Roman troops and the mob. And so every time a Christian was eaten by a lion or set on fire and burned alive at the Colosseum, the Jews were behind it. And this book is unknown. It's called Semitic Anti-Christianism. The Roman Empire turned on Christianity because the Jews were agitating the Roman Empire. Originally, it was a completely tolerated religion.
You know.
So I know how it is.
Jesus.
You have a great book, and you have no income from it.
Nope. Jesus warned us about the Jews who say they're Jews but are not, are of the synagogue of Satan. And how did he know? How did he know about 2,000 years ago about the whole Khazarian Jews who are pretending to be Jews, but their ancestors never set foot in the Holy Land?
Yeah, I'm very troubled by the fact that both David Duke and Professor Kevin MacDonald have come out with something which I consider extremely dangerous, pernicious error. And it is they have directly contradicted the truth, and they say it's not true that the modern Israelis come from the Khazars. It's absolutely ridiculous. In the 600s and 700s, a tribe of Turks living in Ukraine, which had conquered the Ukraine, converted to Judaism, which increased by 900% the number of Jews in the world. They were somewhat similar looking to the Jews of the Middle East because of the Near Eastern appearance of many people. I mean, just because somebody may have a hook nose or black hair or beady little eyes or, olive brown skin doesn't mean you're Jewish. I mean, our Arabs look Jewish, but they're not Jews. Some Armenians look Jewish, but they're not Jews. Some Iranians, some Pakistanis, all these people, they're not Jews. They look similar to Jews because it's a similar racial stock. And I've proven that there's a lot of Neanderthal blood in Middle Eastern peoples, as well as in some Europeans. I mean, the Neanderthal itself, the Neander Valley was actually a valley in Germany. But the Cro-Magnons, the white race, overwhelmed them and took over most of Europe. But there's still a lot of Neanderthal blood in the Middle East. So I have proved, and others have proved, including the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, which is like the Harvard of Germany. They proved that all these Middle Eastern peoples have a lot of Neanderthal blood. And so what the Jews did is they converted similar looking people, both Arabs and Berbers in North Africa and the Khazars in the Ukraine, because they were similar blood and they looked somewhat Jewish anyways, although the Eastern Jews often have slightly Mongolian cheekbones. And if you look at the Ukrainian Jew who murdered Bill Cosby's only son in the 1980s, Bill Cosby's son had a flat tire pulled off on the side of the highway, the freeway in Los Angeles. And this vicious Jew got into a fight with him and shot him dead. But you could clearly, he had Jewish features, but you could clearly see the Mongolian in some Jews. In the cheekbones, and the nose was more Asian. It was a small, upturned Asian-type nose. So the David Duke and Kevin MacDonald both are helping Israel and helping Christian Zionism, whether it's their intention or not, by saying it's not true that the 90% of Israelis who are Ashkenazi, in other words, from Europe, from Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, and so forth, Germany, they are denying that they descend from the Khazars. And they're saying, oh, no, they descend from the Jews of the Bible. Well, then John Hagee's right. And, oh, isn't this wonderful? The state of Israel is the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And so we Americans must support God's will, which is the reestablishment of the Jewish people in the homeland. But if they're Khazars, if they're a bunch of Mongolian Turks with a little bit of Semitic blood, because of the nature of the peoples in that part of the world, they all look similar anyways. A lot of people look Jewish, aren't Jews. Armenians look more Jewish than the Jews do. They often got the hook nose and all the features. I know many Armenians look Jewish, but they're certainly not Jews. In fact, Armenia was the first kingdom in the world to convert to Christianity, very, very early. But they're not Jews, they're Christians, they're Armenians. So, it's very important for American Christians to understand that 90% of the Israelis have almost no real Jewish blood from Bible times. They're from the Ukraine. They're a bunch of Turks. Just because they have black hair doesn't mean they're Jews.
Well, this is part of the problem we've got, and I've told people if you refer to yourself as a Judeo-Christian, you might as well say you're a satanic Christian, because you're listening to John Hagee, aren't you?
Oh, God. I think he's Jewish through his mother, by the way, John Hagee. I also think that the preacher Joel Osteen, there's no question in my mind, by the name and the face and everything, that he's part Jewish. Many of these preachers, there's another guy with some sort of Spanish name down in Florida, and he's Tony somebody, and he admits that he was raised Jewish. It's a big business. I mean, you can make a lot of money as a TV evangelist, and then they're pumping Israel constantly. I mean, the Jews are the people that tortured and murdered Jesus Christ and boast about it. The Talmud is full of hatred to this day against Jesus. And anybody who understands the rudiments of Christianity knows if you want to be forgiven, you must repent. There's no forgiveness without repentance. And Christianity teaches accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Well, if you don't accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, but instead as a Talmud-believing Jew believe Jesus was demon-possessed and a blasphemer, and that Jesus is being boiled alive in hell in hot semen or in hot sewage, which is what the Talmud teaches, then you're not accepting Jesus as your Lord and Savior. You're not accepting him as the Messiah, and you're not repenting. You're justifying his murder. You're justifying his murder. So how can the Jews, in Matthew 23, Jesus clearly says, if the Jews reject God and kill the Son of God, then the covenant with the Jews is over. Now, this is the problem I have with the so-called Apostle Paul. Is in the book of Romans, and especially in the book of Hebrews, it's, oh, the Jews are still God's chosen people, and in the end they will convert, they will accept Jesus, and everything will be fine again. Well, Clay, it's 2,000 years of counting, and the Jews are pretty far from accepting Jesus as their Lord and Savior.
Yeah, they're still not ready to do that, are they? And I've even seen some of them there on YouTube that says, yeah, we're glad we killed Jesus. We'd do it again.
Oh, that's Sarah Silverman. Oh, they keep renewing her comedy show on the Comedy Central. Oh, she said, yeah, I effing do it again. Did the Jews kill Jesus? Yeah, we did. And I'd effing do it again.
That's pretty far out there, but it's the truth here, and it's what we try to put together. But we're conspiracy theorists when they are saying things like this.
Well, I think the real issue is, do we have the courage to face the truth and act on it? And what happened, and this is why I'm so joyful and so proud of white Americans, because 100 years ago, they understood that they had to righteously avenge the rape and murder of this pure young Christian girl, American girl, and they acted. Look, the thing is, they were taking great risks because, I mean, they had the fear. I mean, the North and the Yankee-controlled government had crushed the South just 45 years earlier in the so-called Civil War between the states. The federal government, the powerful Jews up north, could have created a crisis for the state of Georgia. The sheriff, the Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives, the former governor, John Brown, all these people could have been arrested for murder of Leo Frank. I mean, they had abducted and they had so-called murdered Leo Frank. All these men were risking everything. They were risking their careers and their lives by killing this man. But they did it. They acted because they feared God, and they believed in honor, and they believed that the duty of a man is to protect the women and the children. That's one of the primary functions of a man. And that's why we have muscles, and that's why we're big and strong. And that's why we like to watch violent sports like football and racing and baseball and you know, we are men, we are warriors, we are fighters. That's why we have this testosterone. And when our women and our children are being abused or raped and killed, then we must act and wreak righteous vengeance so as to deter other rapists and murderers in the future. I tell you a case that's really bothered me. Last year it came out over in England, in Rotherham, England. 1,400 English children were raped and molested by Muslims with the full knowledge of the town council and the child protective services of this small city in England. 1,400 English children with the full knowledge of the police, the town council, and child protective services, because they're in on it. And you know what happened, Clay, after that? Nada. Zip. Nichts. Nothing. Not one Muslim was strung up. Not one Muslim was even beaten. Not one Muslim was executed. There have been no consequences whatsoever. And the proud people of England once had this mighty empire, were so valiant in the field of battle. We've been so pussified that there's been no consequences. Can you imagine? You're a man and your daughter was raped by Pakistanis who shouldn't even be in your country? And all you do is go in the bar and have a beer instead?
That is insanity. Is that the result of people being dumbed down or what?
The world Jewish government, the protocols.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of things. One is the Holocaust guilt trip. You know, all white Christians are rotten, and we, you know, Hitler killed 6 million innocent Jewish angels, and we, the British and the Americans, we didn't jump into the war until it was too late. He'd already sent them up the chimney, through the gas chambers up the chimney, and you know, and we're guilty of bigotry, and plus we white American and British males, and you know, we oppressed the gays, and we oppressed the women, we oppressed the blacks, and we drove the Indians off their lands. So we're a rotten race. So you have the guilt trip, but beyond that, you have the effect of chemtrails over the skies of England, and America, and Canada, and Australia, and Germany, and France. I say in Germany, it's just as every day, massive, and unless there's a lot of wind, because it causes the chemtrail drift to off target. If it's a relatively unwindy day, the chemtrail every day in Germany, every day in France, every day in England. And then there's fluoride drinking water in many of these countries, most of the United States. It's not in Ireland, a person told me, but it's in England. And the fluoride makes you apathetic. And the chemtrails, the strontium, aluminum, and barium make you depressed and anxious. It's another word for cowardly. You're depressed and anxious, like, you know, everything's rotten, but I'm afraid to do anything about it. Well, that's what cowardice is. Chemtrails make you a coward. And then you have the effect beyond that of the estrogen in the drinking water. Because when women take the contraceptive pill, a third of the estrogen is not used by their body to prevent pregnancy. It's just, it's excreted through their urine into the sewage water. The sewage water is recycled, goes through all these filters, and it becomes eventually drinking water again. But the problem is that the filters do not filter out these teeny tiny molecules of hormones. Human hormones are very tiny and very powerful molecules, and the filters don't catch the hormones. So a third of the estrogen in the pill, which these ladies are taking to prevent having more white babies, goes into the drinking water. So that means you and I are on the pill, Clay. You and I are taking estrogen if you drink tap water. And then beyond that, it gets worse. If you drink bottled water, or if you eat food out of a can with these green lining inside the tin can now, that contains bisphenol A, which is a chemical which leaches into the food or into your bottled water. The longer it sits there, the more it leaches out the chemical into the food or the water. An artificial female hormone. And the end result of all this, and I just reading a website about this, is the levels of testosterone are 22% lower than they were in the 1980s. That's almost a 25%, a one-quarter drop in male hormone in men. And that's the difference between going out and lynching a sex fiend child killer and not going out and lynching a sex fiend child killer. And then the internet is the final blow, because it means you can sit on your computer and type shit and complain and whine and otherwise do nothing. And then slide back with your chair and say, boy, I just accomplished something today. I told another guy who already knows about the Jews and the blacks and the queers and Clinton and 9/11 and the Holocaust and Germany and immigration and blah, blah, blah. I just told another guy who already knows about it even more information he didn't need, instead of going out in the street and getting these bastards. So it's not that white people are a cowardly race. We're a race of conquerors and heroes. But the effect of the chemicals and the brainwashing and now the fake activity that the internet represents is that we're sitting back and doing nothing, and we're staring our doom in the face. So this is why, as we discussed earlier, we need now a new Aryan heroic religion based on the key valid teachings of Christianity. First of all, because I believe Jesus Christ was a divine being sent by God to wake up the world to the Jews. That's why he was raised in the Jewish culture, to tell the world about the Jews from within that community. Growing up in that community, let me tell you, world, the greatest threat to you all is the Jews committed to Judaism. And that's what Martin Luther said. He said, know this, Christian man, you have no greater enemy than a Jew committed to Judaism. Not the average Jew who may not be all that committed, but the Jews who really read that Talmud and suck it into their brain. Like Leo Frank, the president of B'nai B'rith of Atlanta. He was a fanatic Jew. He imbibed the Talmud. He believed what the Talmud says about how God gave the Gentiles to be the slaves of the Jews. And Gentile girls have no right to refuse sex to a Jew. I mean, look, Islam is just Judaism for brown people. And Muhammad says in the Quran, a wife cannot refuse her husband's demand for sex at any time. And if she refuses, let him beat her. I mean, just spelled right out. It's right in the Quran. I mean, women have no rights at all. They are a sex object. They're a breeding object and a sexual release object. And Judaism teaches the exact same thing. And the Gentile especially has no rights. So in Leo Frank's mind, as a Talmud-trained committed Jew, the president of B'nai B'rith of Atlanta, the leading city of the South, he says, she had no right. How dare she refuse him? He is part of God's chosen people. And he was a Jewish aristocrat to boot. And she is a nothing. She's just a going factory girl. So it's not that Leo Frank was a bad Jew. No, he was a good Jew. Raping a Gentile girl was following the commands of the Talmud. He wasn't an aberration. He wasn't a renegade. By raping and killing this girl, he was obeying the laws of Judaism. And that's why the Jews want to clamp down on the Leo Frank case. And I'll have to say, I'm proud of one thing. Many other people have written the truth, especially Tom Watson, 100 years ago, about Leo Frank. And he turned more just against the Jews in general over this. But what I have done is I put into these Leo Frank articles the quotes from the Talmud about how Jews are to view Gentiles and how Jewish men are to view Gentile females. So Leo Frank was not a bad apple. He was not a black sheep of the Jewish family. Leo Frank was being a good Jew by raping a Gentile girl. And that's explosive. And we can use this to drive a huge justified wedge between the blacks and the Jews, because the Jews turned on the blacks to get Leo Frank off. And they were absolutely willing to send two innocent black men to the gallows for a crime that a Jew had committed. So this is a big case, folks, and I'm excited about the fact, Clay, that 100 years ago, these white Southern men got their strapped on their pistols, and they went in there and they hanged that Jew high, as he deserved. Think of what the final seconds of the
after a fair trial, they gave him a shot. They tried him with Jews on the jury, or at least the grand jury.
Grand jury. Yeah, grand jury. Yep. So, I mean, 3 juries: the coroner's jury, the grand jury, which decides whether the state is allowed to indict the guy, and then the petty jury of 12 men who, actually that's the actual trial, was the petty jury of the 12 men. And then Leo Frank appealed it, and Judge Roan, who was furious, and in his verbal, facing Leo Frank, he demanded a new trial. And Judge Roan gave 107 reasons from the bench to Leo Frank why he was guilty. And he was so infuriated at this scumbag bastard that he sentenced him to hang on his own birthday. Now, normally you'd say that's pretty cruel to hang a man on his own birthday, even if he's a murderer. But he sentenced Leo Frank to hang on his own birthday. That's how convinced Judge Roan. And you know what they did afterwards? 2 months after Judge Roan died of cancer, they typed out a letter from Judge Roan saying, "I have grave doubts whether Leo Frank was guilty." They forged a letter on the judge's stationery, where the judge said, "Oh, I think he was innocent." But the judge is meanwhile in his grave, so he can't denounce it as a forgery because he's dead. Vicious. I mean, they actually gave $200 to the black minister of Jim Conley's church to say Jim Conley did it. That a parishioner had come to him, Reverend Ragsdale, and said, "Yeah, Jim Conley told me he didn't murder the little white girl." And Reverend Ragsdale then was so smitten by his conscience, he says, "I can't do this. I can't send one of my own parishioners. Jim Conley goes to my church. I can't send him to the gallows when the Jew did it." I mean, that inflamed the people of Georgia when this black clergyman said, "I was weak. I took $200 back then. It was like $20,000 today. It was a huge amount of money. Or, I mean, it was like $10,000 today. It was a huge, huge bribe for a poor black man with a teeny little black church in Atlanta 100 years ago. But his conscience smit him. It's just like Jim Conley when he was ordered by Leo Frank to help dispose of the body of Mary Phagan. He saw those little hands up in the air, trying to fend off in their last seconds of life, fend off Leo Frank. And he folded her little hands over her breast. So, I mean, this is a case of white and black men doing the right thing against the Jews. So this is a great day in American history, Clay.
It's what we need to do today. I've said this over and over again. Divide and conquer is what their method of operation is. And we need to work together, somehow work together to stop this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. By the way, I'd like to emphasize also that American Mercury, that was a great magazine founded by H.L. Mencken, and it's now an online magazine, and they have a wonderful 2013 series on the Leo Frank trial. We have the huge website. It's been up for over 5 years, leofrank.org, and I'm a curator at that. And of course, leofrank.org, which is hacked by the J-Team constantly. And of course, my own website, and today, johnDeNugent.com. Huge article, 4-hour audiobook. If you're out in your car, you got a long drive. A lot of people go on long drives and vacations in the summertime. You could load that as an MP3. It's up on archive.org, and nice, clear, and I explain the whole case, the intricacies of it, and you can see what a great day this was in American and Southern history. August 17, 1915, the finest, most eminent men in Georgia, heedless of the effect on their careers or their own freedom, out of honor and compassion for Mary Phagan, and outrage at the dishonoring of their state of Georgia and of the South, acted, gun in hand, and rope in hand. And this should be just the beginning, Clay. There's 1 million people in this country, and you'd be swinging from the highway overpasses and the lampposts of every city in America. Child molesters and murderers and rapists and traitors who sell America out to Israel. We have presidents of the United States who need to be arrested, tried, convicted, and hanged for selling America out to Israel. I'd dig up the bones of Lyndon Johnson if I could, among others, for what he did with the USS Liberty. 34 American naval officers and sailors murdered by the Israelis. And he planned the whole thing. He's a half-Jew himself. A traitor. George W. Bush is a traitor. Dick Cheney is a traitor. And the Jews have declared war on us. We are in a state of war. You know, the United States government does hang and execute traitors during wartime. Well, the Jews have declared war on the entire Gentile world. They've declared war on America. They've taken over everything we have. They're destroying this country. They are at war with us. And so every traitor who works for the Jews deserves to be arrested, tried by a jury of the American people, convicted, and hanged, preferably on live television. There's about 1 million people in this country that deserve death for treason or for murder and child molesting. So that's my mission, is to turn this into a spiritual movement and a religion so that we become proud of ourselves again. And like our ancestors 100 years ago, and our ancestors of the American Revolution, that we can look ourselves in the mirror again as men when we shave and say, I did the manly thing today.
John, I appreciate you being on. I appreciate your research on this. You need to know, folks, because it could happen today, and it may be happening every day. One of the things next time I have you on, we'll talk about this Orgy Island, and Alan Dershowitz has been there, Bill Clinton's been there, a few others been there. We're talking about, again, teenage girls being raped or molested at these islands down there in the
Caribbean, yeah.
Caribbean?
Yeah, down to age 10, I mean, you're talking about before the age of puberty. And Bill Clinton flying down there, Alan Dershowitz, actor Kevin Spacey, black comedian Chris Tucker, Prince Andrew of England, and I have a video. You can see Jeffrey Epstein, who was convicted. He did 2 years in prison as a child molester. Was arrested by the sheriff of Palm Beach County, Florida, which is where Donald Trump lives. And by the way, Donald Trump would go to the parties. I'm not saying Donald Trump flew to the orgy island, but Donald Trump would definitely attend parties by Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, this guy definitely did 2 years in prison as a child molester. And I got photos of Prince Andrew with Jeffrey Epstein after he was released from prison, strolling through Central Park. Pictures of Prince Andrew with this girl, Virginia Roberts, who was just a 15-year-old girl at the time, that she was being molested, handed around by Jeffrey Epstein. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And I've got photos of the flight logs of the private Boeing of Jeffrey Epstein, and it lists as one of the passengers, William Jefferson Clinton.
We'll talk about that on the next issue, and people go to shop.freeamerican.com to get some of my magazines, to get my books, to get some of the videos, to order those, and go to freeamerican.com. Take some of these. All you got to do is download them as MP3s. The name of my guest, the URL is below that. John, we're out of time. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on, Clay. Great show. Appreciate it. Appreciate your work.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.